Ashok, welcome to the Health Path podcast. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thanks. Yes, how are you, Alex?
Yeah, I'm very well, thank you. I'm not sure you're going to remember this, Ashok, but it must be close to a decade ago.
Mm.
You came and did a little presentation to a group of practitioners that were working at the London Clinic of Nutrition, which is headed up by Oliver Barnett, and I was one of those practitioners. So that was kind of my entry into the Gupta program and understanding a little bit more about one of these underlying factors when we think of clients struggling with chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia. And now, obviously, you've got an RCT that I saw got published in regards to, I think, long COVID as well. So I'm
Mm.
really looking forward to diving into this today.
Yes, and in fact, I do remember that presentation. It was
Ah,
2018,
it's
I believe.
2018.
Yeah, and so yeah, lovely to meet again after all these years.
Yeah. And am I going crazy, or did you bring puppets to that
That's exactly my lasting memory. I did bring
presentation?
puppets, and for those people who are watching, look, here they are. These are my little puppets that
Ah.
I use to describe the different parts of our personalities. So that's where people find them very useful in how those parts of our personalities cause stress and impact on our gut. So yeah, makes it feel more real when we use puppets.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we sort of dive into this, for those that aren't yet familiar with kind of you and your story, are you happy just to share a brief overview of kind of your journey into kind of where you're at today?
Of course, and many of us start this journey from our own experiences, our own health challenges. And so it was the same with my journey. So I started off with this in the 90s, actually, the mid 90s. I was studying at university as an undergrad, and I contracted some kind of virus. It was a stomach type bug where I had lots of digestive issues and chronic fatigue and all those kinds of things. And I thought, well, no big deal, it'll go away. And I went back to university, and unfortunately, the virus got worse and worse to the point at which the symptoms evolved into something more akin to ME and chronic fatigue syndrome. And it was terrible because I would go from doctor to doctor. They would say, "We don't know what's wrong with you. We've got no real understanding of what causes it, and there's no treatment for you, and you might have it for the rest of your life." It's a real
Mm.
awful way of communicating with patients at that time, and they think it's terminal, nothing we can do. And that started a lifelong quest for me to try and understand what was causing this condition. And in my worst moments, I had to crawl to the bathroom. I couldn't focus on the words on a page. I mean, it was just intense brain fog, intense exhaustion. And for people who don't know what it feels like, I describe it like your worst day of flu times three. It's really a kind of intense exhaustion. And I met lots of others who were suffering from the condition at that time, and I made a pact with the universe, which was, if I can get myself better, I will dedicate the rest of my life to helping others with this condition, because it's such a awful level of suffering that patients go through that's not really seen by mainstream medicine. And I started researching brain neurology, physiology, trying to understand what was going on. And I came up with a hypothesis, and in an ad hoc way, retrained my own brain, got myself well, and then started treating patients myself. So yeah, that's how I first got into this in the late 90s.
Yeah, I think it was sort of 2002 you actually published your hypothesis as well. And I think that's always important to appreciate that there is some really good science that you've been involved in sort of publishing around your work as well.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. So our first starting point was that hypothesis, which was actually published online in 99, and then we got it published in a journal in 2002. And then we, uh, you know, have published medical papers since then, so randomized controlled trials. Because for us, the science behind this is incredibly important to justify and prove the work we're doing.
Yeah, I think, and especially maybe going back to your idea of sort of personalities, for some,
Mm,
it's comforting to know that
mm,
there's science there. There are some people I
mm,
think who you can have all the anecdotal evidence you want, but to be able to say, look, this is the actual data, this is the science, is also very
mm,
reassuring. And I think some people will prioritize that a little bit more than others, understandably. But
mm,
yeah, I think it's great that we now have that as well. Um,
mm.
So I guess that's a segue into like really the Gupta program. So do you want to kind of just sort of introduce our listeners to some of the theory and the principles?
Yes, I'd love to. I think a good starting point is to really help understand what we believe causes these types of conditions, the hypothesis, kind of in layman's terms. And so I always start with this idea of why are we here? Right? Now, you could spend the next hour talking from a philosophical perspective or spiritual perspective, but let's take from a pure scientific perspective. Why are we here? We're here because over millions of years of evolution, this brain, this body, this nervous system has evolved, to be able to adapt to our environment, survive, and pass on our genes to the next generation. So the idea of the evolution of species. And what I find really interesting is that we've come from a whole sequence of nature. So when you look at plant life, single cell organisms, invertebrates, vertebrates, reptiles, mammals, human beings, our DNA actually contains the DNA of a lot of those branches of evolution upon which we have developed. So I found this fascinating. We share 40% of the same DNA as a banana. Right. So it's incredible that we have adapted and survived, not just as human beings, but through previous species from which we have evolved, which is, incredible. And so we are survival machines, and that's the number one priority of our system. And this gives us a clue to these conditions. The brain prioritizes survival over well-being. Yeah. And I think a lot of people might find this really interesting, that I believe we're not living according to our genetic inheritance. So the reason more of these illnesses are proliferating, like long COVID, ME/CFS, fibromyalgia, mold illness, chemical sensitivities, the list goes on. The reason we're seeing more of those is because we're not living according to our genetic inheritance. So in the past, we'd have much more daylight, we'd be moving a lot more, we'd have our skin exposed to sunlight, and we wouldn't have the toxins that we have in our foods. But in the last 200 to 300 years, we've now gone from pretty much an agrarian lifestyle to sitting in boxes on chairs, looking at screens. Ironically, we're doing that now, and consuming food that has a lot of toxins, that have a lot of artificial components to them, and also not sleeping as much, having high levels of stress, and obviously recently spending a lot longer staring at screens and having a stimulated nervous system. The pollution that's in our environment, and all of these things have meant that we live in what I call a pro-inflammatory world. But our system is far more likely to inflame itself and stimulate little aspects of the immune system unnecessarily. That means that our system is more primed to then overreact to certain stimuli. And those stimuli can be some kind of pathogen, so a bacterial infection, a virus, mold exposure, etc. All of these different things. Before, our system would respond, fight it off, and go back to reset. Whereas now it seems to over-respond. And in fact, tragically, the people who passed away from COVID-19, it wasn't necessarily purely from the COVID-19 infection itself, but it was our own immune systems reacting, causing the inflammatory and the cytokine storms in our lungs, which then stopped the breathing, which then people passed away from. So there's precedent for this idea that our own immune system can sometimes be the challenge. And so I want to give an analogy. So let's imagine someone gets COVID-19, okay? And let's take the example of long COVID. Normally our immune system switch on, they fight off the virus and switch back to reset. But because COVID-19 is quite an intense virus, for those of us who've had it, I had it, and I remember it wasn't like a cold or flu. It had a different quality. It was more intense. And a lot of people go into a post-viral fatigue state, which is natural. We have flu, we have cold, we'll feel perhaps tired for a few days or a couple of weeks, and then we'll go back to normal. But in the instances of long COVID, the symptoms just continue and get worse, even following the normal post-viral period. And I give the analogy of, Alex, I don't know if you're a fan of Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
You are? Okay, so Game of Thrones, or let's say any fairy tale. So imagine you're King Alex, and you rule over your kingdom, and you have your army and your navy to defend your kingdom. So your army is your nervous system, so that's your brain, all the nerves, the information flows, And you have your navy, which is your immune system, which fights off invaders. Now, normally, an army comes over the hill, your army and navy fight it off valiantly, the kingdom is saved, everything's good. But imagine there's now a drought in the kingdom. So now the kingdom's weaker than it normally is. And now the army and navy, who are also weaker than normal, they have to fight an invading army that comes in. So that's the pathogen. So I've mentioned things like colds, flus, viruses, mold exposures, but also it can be pain. So sometimes something that's causing us pain, there can be an abreaction in the army and navy as well. So whatever that army is that's invading over the hill, our system fights it off valiantly, throws everything at it. And eventually they manage to defeat the invading army. But now that army and navy are traumatized because they realize that the kingdom nearly fell. It was nearly all over, and survival is the number one priority. So they come to you, King Alex, and they say, King Alex, we need all the resources now. We need the metal, the wheat, the clean water. All the resources now need to be channeled to us because we need to be in a state of battle readiness. Because another army comes, we're going to fall. And that's a logical thing for you as the king to say, okay, that makes sense for, right now. And so the kingdom becomes weaker and weaker and weaker as more resources are being channeled to the army and navy, who keep firing off their war weapons at the slightest provocation. Anything that even reminds them of the previous war, they send off their arrows and their war machines, which then means that even has an impact on the kingdom, because some of those arrows fall back into the kingdom. So that's where you see inflammation having its own effect on the kingdom itself. Yeah. And that is the logical thing for the body to do. And that's how chronic illness can continue, where the immune system keeps inflaming the brain, inflaming the body and the muscles, inflaming the gut. And as a result of that inflammation, we know that then obviously the gut has lots of secondary impacts. So the good and bad bacteria balance changes, all the good work that you do, all of that then shifts and changes, which sends feedback loops to the brain that there's something wrong, which can impact on our mood, anxiety, depression, etc. So there's this vicious cycle going on between the brain and the gut, and the brain and the body. And the body keeps telling the brain, there's something wrong. Look at all these symptoms you're experiencing. And the brain thinks, oh no, we are in danger. Right, fire off the war weapons, triggering the immune system and the sympathetic nervous system, creating a tight, tense body and an inflamed body, which loop back to a hypersensitive brain. Around and around we go in a vicious cycle. And so that's what's happening. The kingdom is getting weaker because the army and navy keep firing off weapons, and some of those are landing back in the kingdom. Brain retraining is when those generals come for their monthly meeting or weekly meeting with King Alex. They say, we need all the resources, keep sending all the resources. And King Alex says, actually, the war is over. You've done a great job, but now you need to stand down, because we're no longer in danger. And they won't like that, because the generals will say, but we nearly fell, right? We need to keep doing this. This is the logical thing to do. But it's helping them update that we're not in that war period anymore. And I found a really interesting analogy here. So when do you think the last soldier was taken off duty at the end of the Second World War?
Oh, no idea. Don't make.
What would you guess? What would you guess? Complete guess.
Oh, let's just go. It's got to be something crazy. So I'm going to say.
You're probably going to overguess now, aren't you?
Yeah. I'll say 3 years after.
3 years after. Okay, so 1948 would be your guess. The last soldier taken off duty at the end of the Second World War was 1975.
What?
30 years later. So there was an island in the Far East where there were Japanese soldiers who were positioned there, and they were told to defend the island at all costs. And they believed that there would be spies telling them that the war was over. So they never believed it. So they kept defending this island, and then people lost touch with them. And 30 years later, their commander had to go to this island and personally tell these soldiers, stand down. The war is definitely over. It ended 30 years ago. And in a similar way, that's what's happening in our bodies. The body's doing its best. It's not doing it to annoy us. It's doing us to protect us because it cares about us. And therefore, it's doing what it's been trained to do. but it's just over responding and needs to be switched off and come back to balance. And so that is both a description of the hypothesis as to what's going on, the brain and body playing a game of tennis, constantly stimulating each other, and then how we train the brain to realize that the danger is over and it can reset and we can go back to homeostasis.
That's such a great analogy, Ashok. Thank you for that. And I guess, that really, it sounds very similar, if not, maybe it's just the exact same principle to some of the literature out there on things like the double hit theory of chronic fatigue syndrome. And you've mentioned that there often can be some kind of pathogen, but it's not just the pathogen per se that's leading to the chronic nature of the symptoms. And I guess that ties in with some of the literature around sort of this idea of sterile inflammation. There's no detectable pathogen left anymore. But as you say, you've got this kingdom that is on edge and sort of hyper responsive.
Exactly. And not only that, so the conditions we've talked about are the ones that we started off with, those real chronic conditions that we see so often in our offices. But it's also now being applied to autoimmune conditions. So even there are doctors using it for Alzheimer's, for MS, for breast implant injury, for a whole host of different conditions where it's obvious that there's a generalized fatigue and a generalized set of symptoms which are being caused by immune reactivity or inflammatory markers, CRP, all those types of things. And this is really exciting because there are, actually a lot of degenerative diseases are essentially autoimmune conditions. And if we can find the right key to the right lock, could we unlock the body's ability to switch off these inflammatory responses and bring healing? And the promise of that is so exciting because I don't believe that any one pill is going to be able to do that, because it's not a hardware issue, it's a software issue. Yeah, and until we can open up the brain, find that distinct neuron and suddenly rewire it, we're going to have to use our own brains to be able to do that. And this is the exciting promise of neuroplasticity.
Yes, I was just going to say, with referring to this concept of neuroplasticity, and I guess before maybe we move on to that, because that might be a new term for some of our listeners. I mean, are we right? Am I right in saying then, as a theme, we're kind of talking about safety, at some level, maybe unconsciously, if not consciously, the individual doesn't feel safe. And part of this process is recalibrating using some of these techniques that maybe we'll touch on in a little bit, and kind of nurturing that sense of safety and not needing the army and the navy to be so hyper vigilant.
Yes, and I think it's safety, as we colloquially may term it, is a very psychological or emotional concept. And here we're taking that idea of emotional safety and making it physical safety. Right. The idea of intense internal physical safety, that my physical life is not in danger and under threat. Yeah. And that, in fact, in neurology, they talk about safety neurons, that when certain parts of our brain are about to react, there are certain neurons which wire themselves from the prefrontal cortex down to the amygdala, down to parts of the limbic system of the brain, that stop and interrupt that very reactive pathway. So brain structure we talk about is the amygdala. And there's two of them. They're like almond-shaped structures that sit behind our eyes. And they're our emotional centers. And so when we experience guilt or anger or fear, those centers seem to be the emotional processing centers. They look at our past memories from the hippocampus and other areas of the brain, compare them to what we're experiencing now, and then create appropriate autonomic response, fight or flight response. And it used to be traditionally thought that the amygdala was only involved in emotional reactions. But now they know that the amygdala is also involved in immune reactions and pain reactions. So you can see, or pain networks. So the brain does not differentiate between the emotional aspect of our lives and the physical aspect of our lives and the biological aspect of our lives. It's just one protective, defensive strategy. And the amygdala is one of the key brain structures where I believe the conditioning occurs. The other one being the insula. So the insula is not in the limbic system, it sits between the limbic system and the cortex. And that part of the brain is associated with a kind of subjective awareness, but also is a physiological master sentinel of what we should be doing or what should be happening in the body. So it takes in all the incoming data, of our immune system, our nervous system, processes it, and creates the appropriate autonomic and immune responses. And what's really fascinating is that, once again, when it comes to the immune system, it was always understood that we have these peripheral immune reactions in our body. So if you cut yourself on your hand, there's a localized immune reaction where the cells know exactly what they need to do through their programming. But does that information get relayed centrally? Nope. So if you have an infection, where does the intelligence get stored to improve the immune system, or to have that memory of what to do if that happens again? It turns out this is in the brain structure called the insula, and we had hypothesized this 15 years ago. And some recent research from Israel, they took some rats and they gave them something that created inflammatory bowel disease in the gut. Yep. And they're able to show that that pathogen directly caused inflammatory bowel disease. Then what they did, they measured the electrical signature in the insular part of the brain. They then got these rats back to baseline, so there was no inflammatory bowel disease. Then all they did was stimulate a slight electrical signature in the insula, and instantly those rats created inflammatory bowel disease. Wow. And all the symptoms of the IBD. And that's the first time in modern science that principle has been shown, that the immune system at a peripheral level sends information back to the insula, and that electrical signature becomes a memory of when we next encounter that pathogen, what do we need to do? And that's the efficiency, because the brain is efficient. It says, let me learn things, and I don't need to do it again and learn again. It needs to be stored centrally. And this is fascinating to me, because what it means is we now could have a reasonable explanation for so many different chronic conditions, inflammatory conditions. It's simply an immune signature, which we hypothesized in our paper in 2002. We called it the stress signature. There's a unique immune signature that gets tied to when we were ill that keeps stimulating itself. And therefore we call our treatment amygdala and insular retraining.
Okay. And you've mentioned earlier how, it could be a sort of emotional stressor, it could be more of a pathogen stressor that sort of triggers the onset of the condition. So in these situations, let's say someone's been exposed to a pathogen, but later on they go through an emotional or a psychological stressor, can that ignite that memory, that map in the insula to then create a flare up in symptoms? I guess what I'm trying to get at here is I often hear of someone who has some, relatively chronic, let's say, digestive symptoms. They get a lot better. Maybe they're completely asymptomatic. And then one day they wake up and suddenly, the digestive system feels like it's kind of shut down again. Nothing seems to have really changed dietary wise, but there has to have been some kind of trigger that meant that actually they're back to kind of square one again. I'm wondering whether what you've described there could be what's happened ultimately. Something has stimulated that insular memory, so to speak. Absolutely.
So we have this idea of neurons that wire together, neurons that fire together, wire together. Yeah. The idea of Pavlov's dogs, you ring the bell and the dogs know it's going to be dinner time. So they salivate even if there's no food, just by ringing a bell. And the same way, the brain gets trained that at the original sensitizing event, when I first went through that illness, I was also stressed or emotional or whatever it may be. And I needed to trigger the immune system to fight it off at that time. Then we get back to baseline. Then the stress comes again. The brain thinks, well, last time I was emotional or stressed, the pathogen was there. Maybe it's there again. Maybe I should also trigger aspects of the immune system, which then once again disrupts the gut, disrupts the body. And then people in the complementary and alternative area, they will do what they can to enable the body to get back to balance. So, and that's the right thing to do, because when you have that trigger, your balance of good and bad bacteria, your SIBO, your IBS, all of these different things, your sensitivity to foods, all of that gets obviously worse. But at the same time, it's recognizing that I believe those are downstream effects. Yep. And actually, as you say, so many nutritionists talk to me about this. They say, actually, it's so frustrating because we get people well, we get them back on track, and they'll have a life event or a stressful thing, and everything comes back again, even though they're eating those foods and having those supplements and everything like that. And I say to them, that's all that's happened is there's been an extra trigger which has imbalanced the system again. And that's where then this type of brain retraining comes in, is to detangle those responses and enable the brain to reset itself and be calmer.
So using your analogy, are we saying that the king's had a panic and he's redistributed the resources back to the army and the navy?
Yes, well, he's received a letter saying, hey, we're going to invade your kingdom. And he suddenly got really stressed and fearful of that. And he's told the army and navy to get ready for war.
Okay, that's fascinating. And so, I mean, I find that quite empowering. It's quite liberating. It gives people an explanation as to what on earth has gone on here. I've been doing so well, and there's no obvious like new trigger. But are we saying, I guess, in some ways, then there's an association, as you say, your brain, your insula is saying, the stress is back, maybe the pathogen's back. So it's kind of making an association from a previous experience that puts us back to where we were.
Exactly. And I give you a good analogy of this. One of my patients, he had chronic fatigue syndrome. And what happened was he had some kind of flu and hadn't got better from that flu, and then continued to have really difficult symptoms. But instead of resting, he went straight back to work in a stressful job. He ran his own business. And so he felt he couldn't take any rest. Right? So he's running this business. And the more ill that he was getting, he wasn't paying attention to it, right? So you can imagine the body, the intelligence in the brain is saying, hey, working in front of a computer is threatening this person's survival, right? Because any pathogen has a potential to, and therefore I need to stop him from doing that. That's an built-in intelligence to the system. I need to be super stressed and super warning him that this isn't right. Then what happened was he got better, he healed, but now every time he would work late or work a little too hard on his computer, all the symptoms would come back, right, instantly by themselves, even if he had no pathogens. And it would take him a few days out, and he would have these severe symptoms, and he'd have to calm himself, do our work, do our program or whatever. Then he'd get himself back to baseline again, right? And then once again, a few weeks later, if he overworked, bang, everything would come back. So you can see there's a conditioned response. The brain has recognized that this person overworking threatens survival. Therefore, I must send these defensive responses if that situation ever happens. So there's an innate intelligence in the system. But the problem with it is that it then overwhelms us. And this is where the deeper lessons of the condition become very important. Now, I never want to say that, somehow having any of these types of conditions is good. Absolutely not, right? It's a horrible experience. But at the same time, now that it's here, we can also recognize what life lessons does this teach us in terms of our personality, our stress levels, etc., etc. And we're very keen to emphasize that our treatment, although it doesn't involve, drugs and whatever, it is not saying it's in the mind, but it is saying it's in the brain. And it's differentiating those two important concepts.
Yeah, I think it's a really important one. I know that I've said in the past that, certainly with some digestive issues, it's not in your head, it's in the gut brain axis kind of thing. It's kind of bringing it to the physical realm, so to speak. But I think that's just so powerful, Ashok, because I've said many a time, and I know other practitioners will have as well, they've used that example of you cut your finger, there's an innate intelligence, you don't doubt that it's going to heal. And that can be true for, some of these conditions as well. But I had never even, the question around where does that intelligence lie had never even really entered my mind. So it's fascinating to kind of hear some of this. So with that in mind, are you happy to share a little bit about the program, just to give people a sense of what to expect if they're sitting here listening, going, "Oh my God, I need to go to the guptaprogram.com."
Well, I think the first thing is really we want to instill that sense of belief that no matter what a doctor may have told you or your support group, healing is possible. We see people healing every day, and they email us and they tell us. So that's the real hope that we want to give to people. And then our program is all done online. So it's great because people can't travel, etc. And so it's an interactive video program where you watch certain videos and you listen to certain audios. And there are weekly webinars with myself where I go through the content. And so we hold people's hand as they go through the Gupta program. And essentially, there are 3 components to it, through the 3 R's of the Gupta program. So the first R is relaxing the nervous system. So that's the preparation. And lots of patients already do that kind of thing in terms of breathing, meditation, good lifestyle, sleep, all of those things that prepare the ground, make your brain more malleable and flexible. Yeah, so especially meditation is very good for that. And if people can't meditate because they find that too anxiety provoking, we have other relaxation techniques that people can use. So that's the first thing. The second R is then the core, retraining the brain. And that's a unique 7-step process where we train patients to recognize those unconscious danger signals that are coming and how to then deal with them. Yep. So it's a unique process, and they repeat those processes throughout the day. And there are some extra tools called the accelerator, which also supports brain retraining. And then the third R is re-engaging with joy. So we find that many patients, when they have these illnesses, feel they can't be happy or joyful or uplifted. They need to get well, and then they will be happy. Whereas actually we can support neuroplasticity and healing when we re-engage with joy despite having these symptoms. And that is very powerful. But the core of it is the brain retraining. That's the main part. And we also want people to get well and stay well. So there are programs out there. Many of them have, let's say, taken inspiration from our program. But they're often like boot camps. They're like, do this thing and you can get well. But actually it's a compassionate approach. And it's a spiritual approach, dare I use the word spiritual, but more, it's a whole rounded holistic approach where it's looking at, well, why did I get ill in the first place? What aspects of me? And let me make sure that for the rest of my life, I can stay well by moderating my stress levels and being aware of what my triggers are, so that we don't want people to get well, we want them to stay well. That's the key.
Yeah, and I guess that's where the lessons, as you were saying earlier, can be found ultimately. I think that the joy piece is interesting as well. I know it's not sort of the core part of the program, but it's something I've reflected on over the years with clients, whereby there is understandably, I think, sometimes that mindset of I'll kind of reconnect with life again once I've healed. And there's that sort of paradox that's almost sort of a prerequisite of healing at the same time. So does anything come to mind, any thoughts or any encouragement around sort of the importance around that side of things?
Yes. When we think like that, as you described, we can become identified with our condition. Yeah. And so we take a piece of paper, the condition isn't just one piece of our life. It's like the big thing in the middle and everything else is peripheral. And actually we need to make the condition less identify with it. I know people will say, well, hang on, but it's, overtakes my life. It affects everything. And I acknowledge that. At the same time, we want to bring in more of the other aspects of our lives. Like they say, there's no path to joy. Joy is the path. There's no path to happiness. Happiness is the path. And in the same way, we can connect with those joyful moments if we choose to nurture it. Yeah. And so for many people, as they're healing, we encourage them to take up little hobbies that perhaps they'd left behind that do actually bring them joy. And it's often artistic things like singing, music, dance, gardening, right? These little joys that help bring us into the moment, they can be very therapeutic and healing because they indicate to the brain that actually we're not in danger, right? So it's the equivalent of the Army and Navy fighting a battle, but then the music band from the kingdom has decided to just march through the middle of the battlefield, playing its tunes, right? So the brain thinks, hang on, I can't be in danger because look, there's this marching band on the battlefield. So it's probably the wrong analogy because people don't have marching bands when they're having battles as well. But you see what I'm getting at. It is really the idea of finding those things that bring you those small moments of joy and going deep into that and nurturing that. And whether that's socializing, laughing. See, studies have shown that things that really impact on our nervous system are laughing, dancing, singing, music, and anything which gets us outdoors, into daylight, gets us with sun on our bodies. Those things can be very healing, very therapeutic. And I'm sure you've heard there's a whole area of what do they call solar therapy, which is all about, you know, sun, infrared, getting that onto your body, onto your skin, and the therapeutic effects of that. So this is all about really reconnecting with what brings you that inner joy.
Yeah, and I love that word nurturing, because I think it's, again, it brings, I think, a bit of softness and compassion to this idea that, you know, we need to re-engage, we need to be gentle, it can start small. And I guess the whole idea with neuroplasticity is by starting to nurture it again, we're creating a greater possibility to reconnect with joy, because it can feel quite alien to feel joy if you've been struggling for however long you might have been struggling for. I can even think through my health journey that at times I've completely disconnected from hobbies and laughter and joy. It's been all very serious. But as you say, nurturing it again, just having little moments even to begin with, to start to build that, I guess, those neural pathways again to some degree, and just those habits.
Yeah, and it's giving ourselves permission to. That's the key thing. But like, often we're in this detective mode, which is there's something wrong with my body. I've got to figure it out. So I'll go from practitioner to practitioner, trying to work out what's going on. So heaviness and seriousness comes into life. Instead, as we say, it's realizing that that is an aspect of your life, but that doesn't stop you from smiling and being happy and laughing out loud when you want to. And when we do that, that actually creates more neuroplasticity. So if you imagine, when we've got to rewire our brain out of these responses, imagine a river going along in a field, like a stream along in a big field, right? And that has its certain path that it's winding along, which is like a neuron in our brain. But we need to shift the neuron into a different area. So we've got to shift the path of the stream in a different way. So we dig a pathway, right? So that's the retraining. We allow the water to go that lube pathway. But if the ground is frozen solid, we cannot reroute the river. And the things that make it solid are when we are feeling down and depressed, right? It's difficult to shift and see openness and clarity to new things when we're in that mindset. Or if we are very busy in our minds, if our minds are not calm but busy, that also means this ground is solid. So there's two things we can do. One is to actually calm the mind through these relaxation techniques, reduce the busyness, reduce the negative thoughts. But then secondly, as we say, re-engage with joy. That is just a preparation that loosens up the soil. Right. Yep. And now you're more open to being able to rewire and then actually have your health back. And with many of our clients, you know, people say, how long does it take? I mean, we say a minimum 6-month program because we don't want people to become complacent. But certainly with things like long COVID, within weeks and months, people can get back to 80-90% recovery using the brain retraining. It can be shorter, it can take longer. We say just keep going with the program until you reach that recovery, because it's an art, not a science. And I think that that's the hope that I want to give to everyone, that healing is possible.
Yeah. And it sounds like the sort of the second part that you described as the core of the program is sandwiched by those two parts, both of which are supporting that neuroplasticity. I guess you've got the emotional side and then the physical side, the nutrition, the sleep, and all of these things that I guess will also be thawing out the frozen field, so to speak.
Yeah, you know, let's take the example of this is a funny example of a husband and wife coming home after a busy day at work, right? So they've both been stressed out. It's been a crazy, horrible day. And we wonder why there's so many relationship challenges, because they both had this stressful day and they both come home and they both want to basically offload, right? Or sometimes, you know, dare I be sexist, but the woman wants to offload, the man just wants to retreat to his own cave for a while, whatever it may be. But at that time, they're both highly stressed. Now, at that point in time, they're more prone to having arguments because there's no neuroplasticity there. It's like, I'm stressed, I've had a difficult day, I'm not interested to try and learn a new way or a new perspective at looking at an argument we're going to have or something that's going on, because they're triggered, they're already stressed out. But the moment they're able to calm down and it's the weekend and whatever, that's a better occasion to then talk things through and be open to the other person's point of view, because your brain's more neuroplastic when it's not triggered. Yeah, so that's a way of looking at it.
Yeah, no, that makes so much sense. And you can kind of feel it, when you're stressed and when you're sort of really in something, you can kind of feel that restriction and constriction, and how there's a lack of fluidity or flexibility physically, but also kind of, I guess, within our cognition as well. So it definitely kind of resonates. Amazing, Asha. I think that's so helpful. And as you say, I hope it gives people a lot of hope ultimately, because certainly I think there'll be a lot of our customers listening who this might be very much new content for, and new information. And that alone can give people a lot of hope, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And I think what's important is people don't think it's just anecdotal evidence. With the studies that we've published, which I think is now our priority, is to prove this objectively into the medical profession. And when we've done a clinical audit on our patients, we found that 92% of patients improved, and 2/3 of patients made a 80 to 100% recovery. So that's 2/3 of patients making full recovery. Then we've done a randomized control trial on fibromyalgia, just published in 2020. And that found, we compared our program to a relaxation program, and we had a 40% drop in fibromyalgia scores within 8 weeks, but 0 in the control group. We halved anxiety, halved depression, halved pain, doubled in, or 50% increase in functional capacity, but very low scores in the control group. And that was published in the Journal of Clinical Medicine. So that was great in terms of people who have pain disorders. We know that there's some evidence now behind that. And then recently with long COVID, we're very pleased that we just published an independent clinical trial, which showed that our program, compared to a wellness program, so this is what most long COVID patients are given, is a wellness program in terms of diet, sleep, relaxation, pacing. Compared to a wellness program, we were 4 times more effective at reducing fatigue and twice as effective at increasing levels of energy, which was a great result, and that's been published. So we're doing further studies. So we're building this evidence base that this actually objectively is a good place to come and heal.
Yeah, definitely. And I was like, I think at the beginning we sort of mentioned how important that is, at least for some people. They'll like to know that you've got published randomized controlled trials on this stuff as well. And the results that you are finding are quite remarkable, really. 80 to 100% improvement is, you compare that to other types of therapies out there, and it's probably the best there is ultimately. Those are some really impressive stats.
And it's taken many years of research and the whole team coming together and putting this. So there's lots of people who work behind the scenes, and so we're really proud of everyone and the efforts they make, because they have that genuine care for the people who have these conditions and the amount of suffering that they go through. And I think it's also making it easy to use. So we're really working on how do we make the Gupta program easier and easier to use, because it is a self-directed program. Some people find that tricky. So something we're launching is called Daily Gupta Size, where you don't even have to figure out how to do it at home. There's a daily Zoom call which you can come on, and we take you through the relaxing the nervous system, so getting the earth ready, and then we take you through the retraining. So people don't even have to think about it. They can just join a Zoom call, and we direct people through it. So that's something we're launching. And we have an app as well, which is great. So that makes it a lot easier to engage with the program. It's just available now.
Definitely. Amazing. And where can people learn more, Ashok? Where should they go?
They can come to our website. So it's guptaprogram.com, which is GUPTA. And there they can take a free trial. So they can sample our videos, our audios, and get a flavor for if this is the right approach for them. And also, obviously, the app. So in a similar way, they can download the app, take the free trial. And because it's in an app form, it's so much easier to just go in, listen to a meditation. We've got lots of free meditations, and some parts of the Daily Gupta Size are also free for patients as well. So we're encouraging, we're calling it where the world comes to heal, essentially. So anyone on the planet can come for this daily healing session on Zoom, feel part of that community. And that's what we're looking to grow.
Yeah. And I guess just to emphasize, you mentioned earlier how practitioners have been using this for things like Alzheimer's, autoimmunity. So it's, You know, I've always thought about it more from a CFSME fibromyalgia sort of perspective, but what you've shared today makes sense that actually it has a much broader audience, for want of a better word.
Yeah, it comes down to our protection mechanisms, our defense mechanisms, which are mainly the nervous system and the immune system. Because they prioritize survival, they sometimes make errors because there's a bias there. Overprotection is better than underprotection, right? And because of those biases in our system, they will tend towards over-inflammatory responses to otherwise neutral pathogens. And because we live in that pro-inflammatory world, they're far more likely to do that. And if we take that as a basis, then we can see that most modern conditions are as a result of that. And what we think 50, 60, 70% of the conditions that someone goes to a doctor for are actually conditions of a pro-inflammatory bias. And then even if you're looking at COVID and the people who pass away from COVID, that also is a pro-inflammatory bias in the lungs that let's err on the side of caution, let's over-inflame with a cytokine storm, which then unfortunately causes the main problems. So even those types of very traditionally Western medicine type illnesses that, you know, we would fight through vaccines and all the other things, actually may also, the underlying problem may be our own immune system.
Amazing. Ashok, thank you so much for sparing the time to come and chat. It's been really interesting, and I think really powerful to have a slightly deeper understanding around your program and the science behind it. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you sort of want to just conclude with?
Yeah, I really feel that the next 5 to 10 years, there will be a sea change in the way that we are looking at, you know, all of these different types of conditions. And I would love people to take a holistic approach, because I think sometimes people can get very hung up on, it's this food, right, that's causing my condition. I need to stop having that food, or it's this supplement that's going to help me, or it's this, or it's this. All of those things collectively are going to support and help. But when we get too anxious and focus on one thing, it can then make us even more anxious and cause even more nervous system stimulation. So the hope is that, you know, 5 to 10 years time, we diagnose people earlier with these types of illnesses, and they get to that holistic approach and brain retraining approach straight away. That's the first port of call, because there's enough of an evidence base behind it. And then we can start really healing people quicker and sooner, as soon as they get diagnosed.
Yeah, I think that's a key message, this idea that the sooner we approach a symptom and illness, the easier, the quicker it is to resolve it ultimately. And I think one of the most common mistakes I've seen over the years in clinic is people having a symptom and it's kind of just progressively got worse, sometimes over years, and now they're trying to do something about it. And it's kind of, I always describe it's more entrenched in the body, and therefore it's going to take longer to rebalance ultimately. So I think that's a really important message.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So yeah, I think that's my main message I'd like to give everyone.
I like it. Ashok, thank you so much. Hopefully we'll connect again, maybe in person at some point as well. But yeah, thank you. I'm really excited to share this with everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alex.